August 21, 1944, 14:30 hours, St. Lambert-sur-Dives, Normandy, France. The smell was what hit first. Cordite and summer heat and something worse. Flesh, metal, petrol, all burning together under the August sun. The road from Trun to Chambois was choked with wreckage. Overturned panzers, shattered horse-drawn wagons, abandoned artillery pieces still pointing uselessly at the sky. Between the twisted steel and splintered wood, they waited. Thousands of them. German soldiers, standing with their hands raised or sitting in exhausted clusters, faces blackened with smoke and dried with dust and fear. Corporal Jean-Paul Michaud of the Regiment de la Chaudière had been fighting for 72 hours straight. He'd seen the pocket close, watched the Allied artillery and air strikes turn the Falaise Gap into what the newspapers would later call the corridor of death. Now, as his unit moved through the carnage to secure prisoners, he watched a young German, maybe 19, still wearing his helmet, drop his rifle and raise his hands with a look that wasn't surrender. It was relief. They expected execution. What they got was water, cigarettes, and a Canadian sergeant saying in broken German, "Sit down. You're safe now." The Falaise pocket hadn't just closed. It had crushed. For 2 weeks in August 1944, Allied forces, Canadian, Polish, British, American, and French, had encircled the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army in the Norman countryside between Falaise and Argentan. Hitler had ordered them to hold, to fight to the last man, to die rather than retreat. Some obeyed. Most, in the end, chose survival. By August 21, when the Polish 1st Armored Division linked up with American forces at Chambois, sealing the pocket completely, the destruction was total. 10,000 Germans dead, 20,000 wounded, and 50,000 captured, the largest mass surrender on the Western Front since D-Day. The Canadians, who had fought through Caen and Falaise with bitter determination, now faced an unexpected challenge. What to do with an army that had just stopped being an army and become 50,000 exhausted, terrified men. Major David Currie, who would receive the Victoria Cross for his actions at St. Lambert, stood in the town square and surveyed the prisoners gathering under guard. "We expected resistance," he would write later. "What we got was collapse. Total, absolute collapse. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were just men who wanted to stop dying." The Germans had been told, by their officers, by their propaganda, by the certainty bred into them through years of Nazi indoctrination, that surrender to the Allies meant death, that the Canadians were savages, that the British shot prisoners. That mercy was a weakness the Anglo-Americans didn't possess. They were about to learn otherwise. If this moment, when 50,000 men discovered the enemy wasn't what they'd been taught, already challenges what you thought you knew about war, stay with us. What happened in the days after Falaise will surprise you even more. The first German through the Canadian processing line at St. Lambert was an officer. Hauptmann, Captain, Werner Schmidt, 12th SS Panzer Division. 28 years old. He'd been fighting since Poland in 1939. He walked forward slowly, hands raised, expecting the rifle but the shouted orders, the casual brutality that came with defeat. A Canadian lieutenant, bilingual from Quebec, gestured him forward. "Name. Rank. Unit." Schmidt answered in clipped German. Waited for the blow. "Do you speak English or French?" "Some English." "You wounded?" Schmidt blinked. "No. Your men." The lieutenant gestured at the mass of German soldiers behind him. "Many. Artillery wounds. Burns. Some have not eaten in 3 days." The lieutenant made a note, then looked up. "They'll be processed. Medical attention for the wounded. Food and water for everyone. Then transport to holding facilities." He paused, reading Schmidt's expression. "We follow the Geneva Convention, Captain. You're prisoners of war, not criminals. Behave accordingly, and you'll be treated accordingly." Schmidt stood there, trying to reconcile the words with everything he'd been taught. Behind him, a young private, a boy really maybe 17, collapsed. 2 Canadian soldiers were there immediately, not with weapons but with a canteen and a medical kit. They lifted him carefully, carried him toward a field hospital tent that hadn't existed an hour ago. "Next," the lieutenant said. The processing took 3 days. 50,000 men, reduced to names and numbers and medical assessments. Canadian military police organized them into groups of 500, established temporary holding areas in fields and clearings, distributed what rations could be spared from Allied supplies. It was organized chaos, the machinery of modern war shifting from destruction to containment in a matter of hours. Sergeant Thomas MacLeod, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, found himself guarding a group of 200 Germans in a field outside Trun. Most sat in silent exhaustion. A few slept despite the noise and confusion. One older soldier, maybe 40, a rarity, approached the wire cautiously. "Bit," the German said. "Please." He pointed at the cigarettes MacLeod was smoking. MacLeod considered for a moment, then pulled out his pack and tossed it through the wire. The German caught it, stared at it like it might be a trick, then carefully took one cigarette and passed the pack around. 30 men shared 5 cigarettes, each taking 2 grateful drags before passing it on. "Danke," the older German said. "Thank you." MacLeod shrugged. "You're done fighting. We're done shooting. That's how it works." But it wasn't quite that simple. Because the men in that field, and in dozens of other temporary holding areas scattered across the Norman countryside, were processing more than just surrender. They were processing the collapse of everything they'd been told about their enemies and themselves. Heinrich Vogel was 23, a corporal in the 2nd Panzer Division. He'd been drafted in 1940, trained to believe in German superiority, in the weakness of democratic armies, in the inevitability of victory. The past 2 months had shattered those certainties with artillery and air strikes and the slow realization that the Wehrmacht was losing. But propaganda died hard. As he sat in the processing line, hands zip-tied with American-made restraints, he watched the Canadians work. They were efficient, professional. They processed wounded Germans before healthy ones. They separated SS officers from Wehrmacht soldiers, not for execution as he'd feared, but for different interrogation protocols. They gave water to everyone who asked and didn't ask for anything in return except cooperation. "Why?" he asked the Canadian private guarding his section. The word came out in broken English. The private, maybe 20 years old himself, looked confused. "Why what? Why you?" Vogel struggled for the words. "Why you give water? Why you help?" The private shrugged. "Because you're thirsty. And because the war's over for you. No point being a bastard about it. I expected them to hate us. To take revenge for their dead, for the towns we destroyed. Instead they treated us like we were human. Like we still mattered. It broke something in me, not in a bad way. It broke the lies I'd been told." The policy that governed the Canadian handling of Falaise prisoners came from the top but was executed by men like MacLeod and the Quebec lieutenant and thousands of others who understood, instinctively, that the war had phases. Fighting was one. Aftermath was another. And how you conducted yourself in the aftermath said everything about what you'd been fighting for. The Geneva Convention, signed in 1929 and ratified by both Canada and Germany, was clear. Prisoners of war were to be treated humanely, fed adequately, given medical care, protected from violence and humiliation. It was a set of rules built on the idea that even in war, some lines shouldn't be crossed. Some civilities had to be maintained. Not because the enemy deserved it, but because civilization itself depended on it. The Canadian Military Command, led by General Harry Crerar and executed by officers like Lieutenant General Guy Simons, made the calculation: security, diplomacy, morality. Security: 50,000 prisoners had to be contained, processed, and moved without incident. Brutality would breed resistance. Fair treatment ensured cooperation. Diplomacy: Canada was holding German POWs while Germany held Canadian prisoners. The treatment of one affected the treatment of the other. Every meal given, every wound bandaged sent a message across enemy lines: we honor the rules. Do the same. Morality: the men who'd fought through Normandy had seen too much death to want more. They'd liberated French towns and villages. They'd seen what the Nazis had done. They knew the difference between justice and revenge. And they chose justice even when revenge would have been easier. It wasn't mercy. It was civilization under pressure, holding the line between barbarism and humanity when the easiest thing would have been to let it go. The field hospital at Trun processed 800 wounded Germans in the first 48 hours. Canadian medical officers worked alongside German doctors, captured but allowed to continue treating their own men under supervision. The wounded came in waves: shrapnel wounds, burns from vehicles hit by air strikes, broken bones from artillery concussions, infections from wounds left untreated during the chaos of encirclement. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, Canadian Army Medical Corps, had been a nurse in Toronto before the war. Now she found herself bandaging the arm of a 19-year-old German whose tank had been hit by a fighter bomber. He kept apologizing, in German she didn't understand, until one of the captured German doctors translated. "He says he's sorry. For taking your time. For being trouble." "Tell him he's not trouble," Morrison said. "Tell him to hold still so I can finish this properly." The doctor translated. The boy, because that's what he was, just a boy, nodded and went quiet. Morrison worked efficiently, cleaning the wound, applying sulfa powder, wrapping it in clean bandages. When she was done, she gave him 2 aspirin and a canteen of water. "Rest," she said, gesturing to a cot. The boy understood that much. She moved to the next patient. And the next. German after German, each one expecting something different than what they received. Each one processing the cognitive dissonance of being cared for by the enemy. By the 3rd day, the temporary camps had taken on a strange kind of order. Canadian guards established perimeters but didn't harass. Rations came regularly, not abundant but adequate. British and Canadian officers walked through the camps, inspecting conditions, ensuring Geneva Convention compliance. They found violations occasionally, guards being too rough, rations being short, and corrected them immediately. The message was clear: this wasn't kindness. This was policy. This was how civilized armies conducted themselves. Learn from it. Klaus Richter had been a schoolteacher before the war. Drafted in 1943, sent to Normandy in June 1944, and now, in August, sitting in a field outside Falaise with 400 other Germans, trying to understand what came next. The Canadians had separated them by unit and rank, a security measure preventing officers from organizing resistance. But within those groups, men talked, compared notes, shared observations. "They gave me chocolate," one soldier said. "British chocolate from a ration pack. Just handed it to me." "A Canadian showed me a photograph," another reported. "His wife and daughter. I don't know why. Maybe to remind me he was human? That we both were." Richter listened and said nothing. He was processing something deeper. For 5 years, Nazi propaganda had taught him that Germany fought for survival against enemies who wanted to destroy them utterly. That surrender meant death. That the Allies were as brutal as they claimed Germany to be. But here he was, alive. Federal bandaged where he'd been wounded. Treated with a kind of bureaucratic indifference that was somehow more devastating than hatred would have been. Because hatred would have confirmed the propaganda. Indifference, professional, procedural, humane indifference, suggested that everything he'd been taught was a lie. We were told we fought for civilization against barbarism. But the barbarians gave us medical care and followed their own rules even when they didn't have to. What did that make us? A Canadian officer walked through the camp that evening, accompanied by an interpreter. He stopped at various groups, asked if there were complaints, if anyone needed medical attention, if the food was adequate. It was a welfare check, the kind a commander might do for his own troops. When he reached Richter's group, he paused. "Anyone speak English?" Richter raised his hand. "Some." "Good. Tell your men that tomorrow you'll be moved to a larger facility. It's about 30 kilometers from here. You'll go by truck. When you arrive, you'll be processed properly, photographs, fingerprints, assignment to barracks. The Red Cross has been notified. You'll be allowed to write home, let your families know you're alive." He paused. "Follow the rules and this will go smoothly. Cause problems and it won't." "Understood." "Understood," Richter said. The officer nodded and moved on. Richter translated for the others. One of them, a young private who'd been particularly vocal about expecting execution, looked confused. "They're letting us write home?" "That's what he said." "Why?" Richter didn't have an answer. Or rather, he had too many answers and didn't know which one was true. If you're starting to see how the aftermath of battle reveals more about armies than the battle itself, stay with us. What comes next shows what happens when 50,000 men realize the war they thought they were fighting never existed. The transit camps established in the week after Falaise were massive operations. Tens of thousands of German POWs, sorted by rank and unit, processed through British and Canadian military bureaucracy. They were photographed, grim-faced, exhausted, still not quite believing they were alive. They were fingerprinted, catalogued, assigned numbers. They were interrogated, briefly, for military intelligence. And then they were sent to holding facilities to await final transport. For most, that meant England. For some, eventually Canada. The vast distance of the Atlantic, the security of an entire ocean between them and the war, made Canada an ideal location for long-term POW camps. By war's end, 34,000 German prisoners would be held there, many of them captured at Falaise. But in those first days after surrender, geography didn't matter. What mattered was the slow erosion of everything they'd been taught to believe. Werner Schmidt, the captain from the 12th SS, found himself in a holding camp near Bayeux. 5,000 Germans, guarded by Canadian and British troops, living in tents, eating from field kitchens, waiting. He'd been separated from his men, officers were always separated, and placed with other captured officers. They talked, late at night, in low voices. About the war. About the lies. About what came next. They shot prisoners at Ardennes Abbey, one former SS officer said quietly. Our prisoners. Canadian prisoners. June right after D-Day. I wasn't there but everyone knew. He looked around the camp. These Canadians must know too. Their comrades were murdered by the SS. And yet they follow their rules. They don't take revenge. Because they're weak, another officer insisted. But even he didn't sound convinced. Because they're disciplined, Schmidt corrected. There's a difference. We were told discipline meant following the Führer's orders without question. But that's not discipline. That's obedience. Discipline is following rules even when breaking them would be easier. Even when you're angry. Even when you want revenge. The conversation died there. Because what Schmidt was saying had implications none of them wanted to examine too closely. The work details started in the second week. Nothing military, the Geneva Convention prohibited that, but labor that needed doing. Clearing rubble from roads. Burying the dead. Loading supply trucks. German prisoners working under Canadian supervision, rebuilding the infrastructure their armies had destroyed. It was strange, surreal work. Men who'd been shooting at each other days earlier now worked side by side, connected by the simple need to make the roads passable again. Heinrich Vogel found himself on a burial detail. German dead, mostly, the Canadians had already cleared their own casualties, laid out in rows for identification before burial. It was grim, necessary work. But what struck him was the Canadian sergeant supervising the detail. Take your time, the sergeant said through an interpreter. Do it right. These were soldiers. They deserve respect. They weren't just burying bodies. They were burying them with dignity. Dog tags collected. Personal effects set aside for eventual return to families. Graves marked with temporary crosses. Not because the dead were friends or allies, but because that's what the rules required. That's what civilization looked like, even in the immediate aftermath of slaughter. I helped bury men I'd fought beside. The Canadians could have just bulldozed them into a mass grave. Instead they let us do it properly. Let us say goodbye. I didn't understand it then. I think I understand it now. They were showing us what we'd lost. What we'd thrown away when we followed men who treated human beings like ammunition. By September, most of the Falaise prisoners had been moved to more permanent facilities. The temporary camps disbanded. The fields that had held 50,000 exhausted Germans returned to French farmers, who plowed under the memory and planted winter wheat. But the men who'd been there, on both sides, carried it forward. Canadian soldiers who'd chosen restraint over revenge, even when revenge would have been justified. German prisoners who'd learned that the enemy they'd been taught to fear and hate were, in the end, just men following rules that protected everyone. Jacob Steiner was 36, older than most. He'd been a postal worker in Munich before the war. Drafted in 1940. Fought in France, in Russia and finally back in France. At Falaise, his unit had been annihilated. He survived by luck. A shell crater to hide in, Canadian troops who accepted his surrender without question. In the holding camp at Bayeux he was allowed to write home. One letter, censored but real. He sat with a pencil and paper provided by the Red Cross and tried to explain the inexplicable. Liebe Margret. I am alive. I am a prisoner but I am alive. The Canadians have treated us fairly, better than I expected, better than I deserved. They give us food, shelter, medical care. They follow their rules even when it costs them effort. I have been thinking about what we were told. About the enemy. About the war. I was wrong about many things. We were wrong about many things. I do not know when I will see you again, but I know this. The men who captured me are not the monsters we were taught to fear. I hope you and the children are safe. I hope this reaches you. I hope when I come home that there is still a home to return to. Jacob. He never received a reply. The letter reached Munich, but by then his wife and children had fled the bombing. They survived the war. He found them in 1947. But the letter, censored, stamped, filed by the Red Cross, survived too. A small piece of evidence that even in the chaos of war's end, some systems still worked. Some humanity still endured. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same Canadian forces that had fought brutally through Normandy, street by street through Caen, house by house through Falaise, were now demonstrating restraint with 50,000 prisoners. It wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Every German prisoner treated fairly became a voice against Nazi propaganda. Every wound bandaged, every meal served, every rule followed, chipped away at the ideology that had sustained German fighting spirit. The Allies weren't winning just through firepower. They were winning through contrast. The Christmas of 1944 found many Falaise prisoners in camps in southern England or Canada. The Canadians, true to form, allowed religious services. Catholic and Protestant chaplains, some German prisoners, some Allied clergy, conducted Christmas Eve masses. Carols were sung in German. No one stopped them. In one camp in Alberta, a German prisoner choir sang Still Nacht, Silent Night. The same carol Canadian soldiers sang in English on the other side of the wire. Same melody. Same longing for peace. Different languages, different uniforms, same humanity. If you're understanding now that the real battle at Falaise wasn't just military, it was ideological, then you're seeing what the men on both sides saw. Subscribe to see more stories where the aftermath of war teaches us more than the fighting ever could. The repatriation process began in 1946 and continued through 1948. 50,000 men captured at Falaise, scattered across Canada and England and Scotland, slowly filtered back to Germany. They returned to a country destroyed, occupied, divided. To cities in ruins and families torn apart. To a Germany that had to confront what it had done and what had been done to it. Some of the Falaise prisoners chose to stay in Canada. Not many, maybe a few hundred, but enough to matter. Men who'd spent 2 years working on Canadian farms, learning English, building relationships with the guards and locals, and decided that Germany held only ruins and memories. Canada offered a future. Werner Schmidt returned to Germany in 1947. His city, Hamburg, was rubble. His family had survived but barely. He never spoke publicly about his time as a POW. But in private, to his children years later, he told them what he'd learned. We were taught that strength meant domination. That power meant the ability to hurt others without consequence. The Canadians taught me something different. That real strength is restraint. That real power is the ability to follow your own rules even when your enemy has broken theirs. We lost the war because we forgot that. Or maybe we never knew it. Heinrich Vogel became a teacher. He spent 40 years in classrooms in Bavaria, teaching history to German children who'd been born after the war. He never glorified what he'd done in uniform. But he never hid from it either. He taught his students about Falaise, about surrender, about what happened when 50,000 men learned that everything they'd been taught about their enemies was a lie. The Canadians didn't defeat us with brutality, he would say. They defeated us with decency. And that was the most devastating weapon of all. Klaus Richter, the schoolteacher turned soldier, went back to teaching after the war. But he carried Falaise with him. In 1983, on the 40th anniversary of the battle, he returned to Normandy. Walked through the fields where he'd surrendered. Visited the Canadian War Cemetery at Bretteville-sur-Lys, where 2,800 Canadian soldiers were buried. Men who died taking Falaise, men who died so that 50,000 Germans could eventually go home. He placed flowers on several graves. Chosen at random. He didn't know their names or their stories. But he knew they'd been part of something that had changed him. That had shown him what he'd lost by following the wrong cause. That had given him, in the end, a second chance at being human. The Falaise pocket closed on August 21, 1944. In military terms, it was a decisive Allied victory. The destruction of 2 German armies. The opening of the road to Paris, to Belgium, to the Rhine. The beginning of the end. But in human terms it was something more complex. 50,000 men who expected death and received processing. Who expected brutality and received bureaucracy. Who expected revenge and received the Geneva Convention, applied methodically by men who just spent 2 months in hell and chose restraint anyway. The battlefield is studied in military academies. The tactics analyzed. The decisions debated. But the aftermath, those 3 days in fields outside Trun and Chambois, when 50,000 Germans learned that their enemies were more disciplined than they'd ever been, that part is often forgotten. It shouldn't be. Because the real victory at Falaise wasn't just military. It was ideological. It was the demonstration that civilization could hold even in the immediate aftermath of slaughter. That rules mattered. That restraint wasn't weakness. That treating enemies humanely wasn't naive, it was strategic, moral, and ultimately more devastating than any revenge could have been. If this story showed you that the hardest battles aren't always fought with weapons, share it. Because understanding how armies treat defeated enemies tells you everything about what they were really fighting for. Today, the Falaise pocket is marked by memorials and museums. Canadian, Polish, British, and American monuments stand in fields that once ran red. Tourists walk through the corridor of death, try to imagine the carnage, usually fail. But in a small town in Bavaria, there's a man in his 90s who still remembers the taste of British chocolate given to him by a Canadian soldier. Who remembers a field hospital where a nurse bandaged his wound without asking which side he'd fought for? Who remembers being processed, numbered, catalogued, and treated like a human being by men who had every reason to treat him as less? He tells his grandchildren about it sometimes. About surrender. About expecting the worst and receiving something different. About learning, in the rubble of defeat, what civilization actually meant. They taught us, he says, that you don't measure an army by how fiercely it fights. You measure it by how it behaves when the fighting stops. The Canadians won twice at Falaise. Once with bullets. Once with restraint. The second victory mattered more. The fields have been replanted dozens of times since 1944. The wheat grows tall every summer. The blood has long since washed into the soil. But the lesson remains, carved into memory by the men who lived it. The war taught them to kill. The aftermath taught them to remain human. Only one of those lessons built a future worth having.